Good afternoon. We're delighted that you could be with us this afternoon for our second lecture this year. We just began and we have another one coming up in January, and then we'll probably have a pause. But today we're really fortunate to have Dr. Jeffrey Kahn join us. My name is Catherine Brown-Saltzman, and I am the co-director of the Ethics Center here at UCLA. How many of you are here for the first time at an ethics lecture? Anybody? Great, wonderful. We hope you'll come back. We do these pretty regularly. We have a web page under the resources on the MedNet page, so you can go and click there and see what we have going on, not only in terms of the lectures, but other educational opportunities. So let me take a minute and introduce Dr. Kahn. He is the Andreas Dracopoulos, and I thought I had it down, director of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. He's also the Levy Professor of Bioethics and Public Policy and Professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management in the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. His research interests include ethics of research, ethics and public health, and ethics and emerging biomedical technologies. He speaks widely both in the United States and abroad and has published 4 books and over 125 articles. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and a fellow of the Hastings Center, and has chaired or served on committees and panels for the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Medicine, where he is currently the chair of the Board on Health Sciences Policy. His education includes, and you can all cheer on this one, a BA in microbiology at UCLA. So he began his roots here, and an MPH at Johns Hopkins and a PhD in philosophy out of Georgetown. So Jeff, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation and for having me, and it's, as you can see, good to be home. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Sherman Oaks, and am a proud Bruin class of 1982, believe it or not. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about some history, very little bit about history, and then try to bring us up to the present. And the thread here is about the challenges that technologies, as they advance, pose for how we think about science policy, and in particular the ethical challenges and the way science policy attempts to address them. So my plan is to go a little bit fast. I have a fair number of slides, but I hope to be able to leave some ample time for us to talk as well. So let's see how I do. And I've got, you'll see in the course of this, a sort of category and then the example that follows. And so one of the examples in science policy that people love to point to is the result of something called the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA Molecules. Anybody in the audience, by show of hands, how many know Asilomar? That's an important history. Okay, just a couple. It's called that because of the conference center where the meeting was held, and it was held in, as you can see here, maybe you can't see, but the science the screenshot here from the Science article that was published is from June 1975. And it was authored by Paul Berg, David Baltimore, Sidney Brenner, Richard Roblin, and Maxine Singer. These are all extremely well-known names in the history of molecular biology and recombinant DNA technology. And so the important thing to say here is the scientific community at the time, the people who were engaged in this research, said to themselves, and had a meeting among themselves to say, we need to figure out how to regulate ourselves as a sort of voluntary matter, because if we don't, the government will do it to us in a way that we really don't prefer. So better to control our own destiny. And so they proposed self-imposed limitations on the use of these technologies to some limited success. So it turned out that it was well received as a matter of the scientific community being responsible. But since then, the National Institutes of Health, through an oversight body within the NIH called the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, or the RAC, it includes guidance about what can and can't be done in humans with recombinant DNA technologies, and here's the important highlight here. It says the NIH will not, at present, entertain proposals for germline alteration. All right, so the strong prohibition that's relevant for the rest of my talk is going to be this one, instituted really in the late 80s into the 90s and continues today. We may not, as a matter of the science and its oversight, propose any kind of intervention that creates what we would call germline modification, heritable genetic change into the next generation. And that was among the things the Asilomar conference also articulated. But it was so early days of recombinant DNA, so much uncertainty that it didn't seem at all plausible to even think about whether that was possible, let alone acceptable. All right, so that's example number one. Second category is where an ethics boundary instituted into policy got created by the limits of a technology. And that relates to the creation and research on embryos in vitro, outside of the human body. And it turns out that for reasons that are now recently being challenged, embryos could not, just as a matter of technicality, live in vitro in a petri dish past 14 days. So they would divide up to 14 days and then stop. And that seemed to be about the right time to think about a sort of limit on their use, because at about 14 days and past, we start to get organization into something that looks like neurological development. Primitive street is formed. And so it made some sense to say, well, 14 days seems like a good policy limit in terms of what could be done in a laboratory as a matter of science policy, and that was adopted in the United States and pretty much everywhere in the world. In the US, you probably know, we don't fund with public monies. No taxpayer dollars can be used on research that harms or destroys a human embryo. But as a matter of the work that is done without public money, the 14-day rule has been imposed and implemented. And that's been true not only in the US, but across the globe. Well, that was a convenient limit because that was all that embryos seemed to do in vitro anyway. But now that seems to be challenged. There's actually a group here to sort of give you a sense of what I just said in a cartoon form, not hard to follow, I hope, for those of you in this audience. But there's been a movement to re-examine whether the 14-day limit is appropriate, because there's been some success, mostly in the UK, with growing embryos past the 14-day limit in vitro. And so the convenience of what can be done technically doesn't now match up with what the policy that got created was imposed. So time to revisit the 14-day rule. We'll learn a lot more if we allow embryos to grow past the 14-day limit in vitro, but that would require us to be creating a limit that has some connection to an ethics argument rather than a technical limit. And that's challenging the way we have set up the science policy in this area. The next category is what happens when innovation bypasses what had been either an ethics boundary or, in the case of the 14-day embryo rule, a kind of convenience boundary. And that's an argument that's been pushed by people like George Church, who have pointed out that we actually don't need to let embryos grow from one fertilized egg for 14 days and get however many cells come from that, and think of that as the limit of what can happen over a 14-day period. So he's shown that one could take cells that are further along and create embryoids out of stem cells, effectively, that would be much further along in development if you let them grow in a petri dish past 14 days, or even to 14 days. So you would get something with much more developmental organization, even if you limited yourself to 14 days in a petri dish. It's the starting point that would be different. And so his push, and if you know George Church's work, he's sort of always provocative about what may or may not be possible, mostly, I think, having known him for a while now, as a way of forcing the scientific community and the science policy community and the science and ethics community to think prospectively and proactively about what's coming and be prepared for that. His point is we need to be thinking about the features of early human development that matter, rather than how many days one can grow an embryo or an embryoid, an embryo-like thing in a petri dish. So it's not appropriate to think about time, it's more appropriate to think about developmental milestones and what should those be as a matter of good science policy. So we're sort of outstripping the technical limits in two different ways. One, how long you can grow something in a dish, and second, the starting point may not be sort of just one egg fertilized by one sperm. The next sort of limit-pushing category is when human ingenuity takes what are the limits of science policy and sort of blows a hole in that. And that's a story that stems from the use of this technology. This is a photograph, at high magnification obviously, of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis being performed. So that's an embryo that's 2 or 3 days post-fertilization at the 8-cell stage. The red image on the left is a pipette that's holding that embryo in place, and then the finer pipette on the right is actually doing a biopsy on that embryo. And you can see there's a single cell being aspirated out of that 8-cell stage. That's called PGD, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The DNA in that 1 or sometimes 2 cells are biopsied out, can be used to do genetic testing. That's a picture, obviously, of a family whose names are Nash. And it's a story that you probably will remember when I tell you a little bit more about it. But Jack and Lisa, the parents there, had a daughter who was born with a disease called Fanconi anemia, a genetically inherited disease that causes leukemia by the age of 6 or 7. And you can see she's sitting on their laps with her baby brother there, which I'll tell you about in a second. But you can see her wrists are sort of misshapen, and she doesn't actually have thumbs, which is a feature of what happens with children who are born with Fanconi anemia. Those things can be treated, obviously, so you can do repair on that frozen joint. And they also are born with incomplete gut, often, which also can be surgically repaired. But when you've got leukemia at 6 or 7 years of age, you need a donor. So we used to call that bone marrow transplant. That's now called hematopoietic stem cell transplant, because you can use either bone marrow or cord blood from a donor. And that baby sitting in her lap is her baby brother, whose cord blood was taken and used to do a transplant to her. The story here is that this couple realized that they had a real challenge ahead of them when their first child, Molly, sitting in her parents' lap, was born with Fanconi anemia. The two parents, Ashkenazi Jews, were carriers of Fanconi anemia, didn't know that, and they sort of were unlucky in that the first of their children, 1 in 4 chance of inheriting the mutation from both parents, did so and was born with the features of Fanconi anemia. They didn't have any other children to be bone marrow donors. Neither of the parents were a good match, no other sibs to go to, and so they thought, wait a second, we can use this technology to do genetic testing on embryos that we make in vitro. Did that, and like lots of other couples who knew they had genetic risk of passing on a disease to their future children, they wanted to test the embryos and make sure that the one they implanted into Mrs. Nash's uterus didn't carry the Fanconi anemia double mutation. Easy enough to do, and that's been done since really the 80s for things like cystic fibrosis. But they also wanted to do a second round of testing on the embryos that were Fanconi negative, and that was to figure out whether the embryo was HLA, that is immune matched, HLA compatible with Molly. And so that was an ethics breach in many people's minds, that they would want to do not only a disease prevention, but a genetic match to the child who needed a transplant. The baby that was born as a result of the one embryo, this is not the one embryo, but this one of turned out 17 embryos to get one that was both FA negative and HLA matched to Molly, was implanted, and the baby that you see sitting on Molly's lap was born, named by his parents Adam Nash. Named Adam because, if you remember the story of Genesis, a rib from Adam was taken to create Eve, and so they, with a whole lot of sort of heaviness there, named their child Adam because his cord blood was taken to save his sister Molly's life. It worked, luckily. Here's a screenshot of them some 6-7 years later. So it's a little bit small. That's taken from the monthly magazine in Denver, Colorado called 5280, which is, as you see there, a story and follow-up to the miraculous story of Molly's life being saved by a cord blood transplant from her brother Adam, happily ever after. However, raising some significant challenges. This book, anybody read this book? Not a great piece of literature, made into a really even worse movie, but nonetheless, this is the story taken from the Nash case. And in fact, Jodi Picoult, who wrote this book, a best-selling novelist, interviewed the family, interviewed me. I was actually part of the sort of review of this case when it took place at the University of Minnesota, and interviewed the physician taking care of Molly, who's an expert in Fanconi anemia, named John Wagner. And she told us all that she was going to write this story of the heroic efforts on the part of a couple to save their daughter's life. That's not the way this story turned out. The Nash family wasn't really particularly happy with the portrayal, although it was fictionalized and not their story. It was about two sisters, not a sister and a brother, but nonetheless a story about their lives and how it could have gone badly off the rails. It didn't in their case, but could have. So why is this an issue? We don't have ways to capture the concerns that are raised by a story like this, which are, among other things, that the Nashes could have chosen for any number of things as a matter of genetic testing of the future offspring. They chose not only to avoid disease in the baby we call Adam, but also that he would be a match for his sister, which was not for him, really, it was for her. Now, from Adam's perspective, but for the fact that you chose not only to have a FA negative child, but one that was matched to Molly, my sister, I would not have been born. So good for me. But it raises some pretty interesting questions about how far parents ought to go in selecting traits of their future offspring. All right, why can't we control this? So here's where we get to the policy part. We've got a ban in this country, as I mentioned in the earlier part of my talk, that doesn't permit, actually prohibits, federal dollars from being used on any research that harms or destroys federal, sort of human embryos. The impact of that is federal monies cannot be used, but private money can. But in this country, part of our civics is when federal monies are used for something in biomedical research, federal rules follow. When there is no use of federal dollars, and it's a category that we can't use federal dollars, there are no rules coming from the federal government. So it's a wide open space. Sort of odd, but that's the way it is. We prohibit the use of a particular use of federal monies in a particular area of research. We just don't make any rules about it, and so it leaves a wide open and what I would say under policy result. The second thing in this particular case is you might say, well, the insurance companies sort of help us decide when technologies ought to be used. True, but in this case, the insurance companies wouldn't pay for that combination. It was all deemed outside of covered medical services. And so they're not interested in assessing the appropriate uses of technology they don't pay for. So again, another big hole in policymaking. And the third is that people who perform the services like PGD and IVF have very limited interest in regulating themselves, unlike the Asilomar story. This is an area, reproductive medicine, is an area where there's very little self-regulation and the federal government isn't really involved for the reasons that are already on here and the fact that the FDA in our country does not regulate reproductive technologies. So three big gaps in policy, which means we don't have a way of taking this on without some sort of new approach. All of this is also, these same three things apply to the human embryonic stem cell research debate, which those of you in California who pay attention to this, of course, know well, and leaving opportunities for places like California to invest in ways that the federal government would not. The last thing in this particular story, which makes it even more challenging than the above three things, is even if we wanted to get our hands around it, very hard to figure out how to do that given that the three parts of this story happen in three different places. IVF was performed in Denver, Colorado, which is where the family is from and lives. The PGD, because of the controversial nature of it, was performed in Chicago, the only clinic that could find to actually do the biopsying of the embryos created in Denver. It was done by a PGD clinic in Chicago, lots of flying back and forth with small vials with few cells in them and genetic testing performed, believe it or not. And then the third part that the transfusion, the transplant of the cord blood was performed in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota. So all those three places said, well, we just did our part. We weren't responsible for the whole thing. Not up to us to decide what the group in Chicago does with their PGD if you're either Colorado or Minnesota, and not up to Colorado or Chicago to determine what should be done with a cord blood that's born of a baby and taken to Minneapolis. So you see the problem here. There's sort of nobody responsible for the whole thing, and everybody's got plausible deniability. All right, so you see, come to this conclusion without even having to say it to you, but it's sort of a perfect storm of too few rules and too strong interests and incentives. And all of this figured out not by any of the players that I've mentioned in terms of the performance of the parts, but rather by the parents. So Lisa Nash is a pediatric ICU nurse, and Jack Nash, her husband, is a part of the partnership in his family business, which owns a chain of hotels in Colorado. So they flew back and forth between Denver and Minneapolis on a private jet, had enough resources to do this on their own nickel, and they figured out how to do it because of Mrs. Nash's strong, not only knowledge of, but participation in the biomedical research enterprise. So a kind of interesting combination. All right, so I've sort of led to this too a bit in the other things that I've said. Among the stories here is as technologies emerge, there are a few options to us. We can regulate them, we can make rules, we can avoid making rules, or we can create prohibitions. But this category is about why prohibitions and bans are not only sometimes, I would say almost always, worse than no rules at all. So this is a story about a very new emerging technology called mitochondrial replacement. By show of hands, would people know what that even means? Very few. So I'll do my best at giving you the nickel version of this. As you can see, I would walk over there, but we're doing video webcasting, so I won't, and I don't have a microphone that will let me do that anyway. But the point of this cartoon is to show you how this technology would work. It's two eggs, one egg from a woman who's got the risk of passing on mitochondrial DNA disease, and those little purple parts of the cartoon of the lower left are disease-causing mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy-producing organelles in each of our cells, right? And it turns out that some women, because of the way mitochondria are passed from mother to child, and they're always in eggs. They are in sperm, but they get degraded very quickly after fertilization. So it's a maternal lineage passage. Those mitochondrial DNA diseases are coming from women to their offspring. So some women know that they have a risk of passing on mitochondrial DNA disease, and the only way to avoid that would be to either adopt, have an egg donor, so a stranger be the egg donor fertilized by sperm from your partner or spouse or donor, and then implant that embryo. But that baby would not be genetically related to the woman, right? She'd be the carrier, but she would not be the genetic mother. And so these women have a very strong desire to have healthy but genetically related children. The only way to do that is to take the nucleus, and you can see the second stage from that lower left egg. The nucleus is taken out. A little bit of mitochondria go with it because you got to take a little bit of cytoplasm when you take out the nucleus. You physically extract it. And then a donor egg, which is on the top there, has its nucleus removed. So you've got the cytoplasm from the donor egg and the nucleus from the mom who wants to have the baby, and you put them together. Genetic contribution from two women. The nucleus from the woman who wants to have a baby but's got mitochondrial DNA, disease risk, cytoplasm from the donor egg, put those together, fertilize it, that's the little sperm that you see being injected through something called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, and you get an embryo which is then implanted. And that baby, in theory, would have the nuclear DNA from the woman who wants to have the baby, but not the mitochondrial DNA disease risk. Am I making sense? Great. So that's MRT, or mitochondrial replacement techniques. That's a cartoon, as you see there, from the the legend there on the bottom. It's from both a report from the UK and from an Institute of Medicine, now National Academy of Medicine report that took on the ethical and social and policy issues related to this technology in response to the FDA being having a license application submitted to do this in the United States. I chaired this committee, why I can talk about this in any level of detail. So this is a big challenge. Why? Right? This is going to be the answer to the question. So MRT offers a way for people to have children that would be genetically related, not at disease risk. It's a very novel, emerging reproductive technology. The FDA has asserted that they would have oversight authority for the first time for reproductive technology because this, in their minds, and I think no one would argue, represents greater than minimal manipulation of cells. It's much greater than minimal manipulation. This is pretty maximal manipulation of cells. Never before been done in a human. Never before been done to create a human this way. And so it needs a lot of animal and other kinds of model information before we would go forward for the first time in a human context. Very hard to think about how to set up a clinical trial when this would be done for the very first time, and that's what the FDA was interested in. However, if I have this here, the FDA, as it was getting ready to implement the recommendations of this report, which said you can go forward and here's the way with a lot of detail about how to do that, the Congress of our country in December of 2015 included in a budget reconciliation bill for that year a prohibition on the FDA receiving any license applications that would lead to germline modification in a human embryo. Now, you might say, well, what's germline modification have to do with this? Well, you've created a genetic change in this embryo than what would have existed in nature in a way that would be passed on to future generations, right? All of the female offspring of this technology would have this combination of nuclear DNA from one woman and mitochondrial DNA from another. The males would not, because the males would not have the mitochondrial DNA to pass on, right? They would have those mitochondrial DNA from the donor woman, but they wouldn't pass them to the next generation. So one way to blunt this as a problem of germline modification is to say only boys could be created this way. It's one of the recommendations of the committee report that I chaired. But the FDA didn't find that, or the Congress didn't find that sufficiently restrictive, and so issued a prohibition, effectively, against this technology or CRISPR, Cas9, or any gene editing technology that would result in heritable genetic change in a human embryo. So we've got a prohibition in this country since the end of 2015, and if you think about that timing, end of 2015 was the end of the Obama administration. After the election, but before the inauguration. And what's interesting about that is they knew that this had been inserted into the budget bill and chose not to fight it. So it's not something to blame only on the current administration. We find that to be problematic. Okay, so what happened? This is a screenshot, of course, from a New Scientist article, and you might see it says September 2016. They had the exclusive report of the world's first baby being born from this technique. Not in the United States, because it couldn't be done in the United States, but by United States researchers, actually reproductive medicine physicians who have a clinic headquartered in New York. They opened a satellite clinic in Guadalajara, Mexico, and performed this technique there on a couple who came from Amman, Jordan. So not an American patient, although American physicians and researchers, but performing this technique outside of the United States in a country where there were no restrictions because there are no rules about this at all. So the prohibition pushed that research outside of the United States to a place where it could be done without any oversight at all. That's the problem. We have no ability to understand how this was done, under what circumstances. The child's lost to follow-up, went back to Jordan. We don't even know the name or how to find them. So big problem. Yep. This, at least, in this case, was about preventing mitochondrial DNA disease risk. This is about using the same technique not for disease risk at all, but because there's a theory that women of advanced maternal age have a hard time getting pregnant because their mitochondria are tired. They're not making energy at the level that they need to, and so we could use this technique. So this technique, would at the top level, right, the donated egg would come from a younger woman, which would allow the nucleus from a woman of advanced maternal age to be put into a cytoplasm of a younger woman, and therefore recharging that egg in a way that would allow her to get pregnant. And that supposedly is being done in the Ukraine, in Kiev. Again, outside of control. Would be prohibited in this country, but here you go. This is what happens when we push things out of our oversight. So the positive way to say this is strict control, but control can sometimes create a pathway for innovation, and that's what's happened in the UK. So in the United Kingdom, there actually is, after a long involved process, which culminated in the vote in Parliament, so they had to actually go through parliamentary vote because of the policies that had been in place, have allowed this to go forward, but in a very controlled way. MRT can proceed in the UK with a license that comes from something called the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. Sounds a little Orwellian, but that's what it's called, which gives license for every single use, creation and use of a human embryo in the UK. And they have said they would go forward and license one patient and one clinic at a time for this technique to be used, assess the results, and then decide whether to go forward. So very tight control, but a pathway to allow innovation with data being collected and in a much more careful and controlled way than we've got from the previous two stories. Okay, so the upshot here, sort of answer my own question from the very beginning of the talk, is do we need new rules? Well, we at least need a new approach, if not new rules, because as the science advances, it challenges the rules that have been put in place for either good or bad reasons. So this has been a topic of conversation in the science policy community, as you might expect. This is from now a couple of years ago already, October of 15, where Nature, in an editorial, talked about after Asilomar. So could we think about another Asilomar-like event where we would get the scientific community together, or the scientific community would get itself together and come to some conclusions? I would say no, it's not possible anymore for reasons that I'll talk about now. 21st century science is very different than 20th century science for a few reasons. One, we've got far more democratic, and in a good way democratic, access to the techniques than we used to. So you can't now have David Baltimore and a few of his friends come together in a place and say, this is how the scientific community will behave. There are just way too many people that have the ability to use these things. So we don't have single country or even two country leadership like there was in the past. There's much less expertise required to use some of these new gene editing tools, which is really the focus of where this part of the talk goes. So CRISPR-Cas9 and the things that are coming after it can be done by people without specialized labs and for not a lot of money. A lot better access to tools, but that makes it much harder to control. So self-policing would really have much less bite if we could even figure out how to do it. This is the single page with principles from a National Academy's committee report on the use of human genome editing and how it might go forward. This was a committee that was co-sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences in the US, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, obviously in China, and the Royal Academy in the UK. So an attempt by the at least large science countries to get together and come to some agreement about what at least principles might look like for the oversight of these kinds of areas of science as we go forward. The important thing to say is not what these 7 are, but rather the funny-shaped blue box over here on the right, which says any nation considering governance of human genome editing can incorporate these principles, I would say should incorporate these principles and the responsibilities that flow from them into its regulatory structures and processes. So we can't create policy for all, but we certainly can say these are the right principles that should inform policy, and if we do that, we're going to get something that looks like at least a common set of approaches to what's acceptable and what's not in this area. Challenges, however. Principles are not the same as governance, not by a long shot, and we're going to see quite big differences in translating principles into governance, in that certain principles will be privileged over others. In our country, we cherish individuals getting to decide for themselves. This notion of self-control, autonomy, respect for persons sort of trumps everything else. And differences in cultures and societies will lead to very different kinds of governance informed by the same set of principles. So the Chinese have a very different sense of the value, the moral value of the human embryo outside of the body than does the U.S. by its politics and policies at least, than does Germany, than does France or Italy. And that's fine. It's not a matter of a critique of what's right. It just will lead us to very different places about what's acceptable to be done. In addition, there are very different weighting in the way that different cultures and different societies think about physical versus cultural harm. So we invest a lot in making sure individuals are not harmed. That's physical harms, with much less weight on what we think of as, what might think of as harms to our culture or to our society, which is much more important in other parts of the world. And that will, of course, lead to different kinds of policies as well. And then whatever principles get endorsed and turned into governance, there will be the reality of people going to the places that they can get the things that they can't get where they live. So medical tourism is real. It's very difficult to control, and there are incentives for people to find ways to get things done, as the Nash case has already showed us. So as this story unfolds and evolves, one of the messages that has come out of the report that I showed you a screenshot from a moment ago, and really all the other conversation, is there needs to be transparency in the process and inclusive public engagement, which we are not very good at in the US, but at least we talk about. The UK has a much deeper and better track record in this regard, but it's a much smaller and mostly more homogeneous country than are we. This would be impossible to do in China, both politically and just practically, when there are 1.3 or 4 billion people, and their notion of transparency and inclusiveness of public engagement isn't part, at least of their current society. How much weight do we give that? And as it says, that will vary from country to country. So we're sort of on this path, and I'm sure you have followed the story of the group at the Oregon Health and Science University, who says that they have successfully edited human embryos for the first time. There's a fair amount of sturm and drang in the molecular biology community about whether they actually did what they said or whether the explanation for what their results were are as they have stated them. And so there's much more science to be done, but it's pretty clear we're on a path to trying to figure out how to apply CRISPR-Cas9 and other gene editing tools in human contexts. So we need to be having these conversations. And so the last thing I'll say, and then we'll have time for your questions and comments, is where we're headed. So how do we get our hands around this in a way that might yield better science policy, or at least some science policy compared to what we have? So the good news is there's ongoing international dialogue. That dialogue started in the late 2015 with an international summit in Washington that was co-sponsored by the same 3 entities that co-sponsored the committee that I mentioned before. That's the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and National Academy of Medicine, the Royal Academy in the UK, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They launched the consensus committee report that resulted in a report issued in February of 2017. There will be another international summit to both talk about the results of that report and the science that has transpired since December of 2015. That will be held somewhere in China sometime in 2018. It's looking like it will be Shanghai in the early part of 2018, but we'll see. And then probably 18 months to 24 months after that, another will be held in the UK. So there's sort of movable feast, if you will, of discussions about not only the science, but the policy and ethics of these evolving technologies as they get applied in human contexts. The second thing that needs to happen, and people are working on, I'm working on this myself, is further articulation of the principles, those 7 that were listed on the slide that I showed you. So what is the deeper conceptual basis for them, and are they the right 7? And what is their foundational support so that we can actually make good moral arguments about what the principles ought to be, and therefore help direct governance as that governance gets made. And from that should come, if not international policy, international norms based on more deeply understood principles, combined with experience coming out of the bench and maybe early human research, and of course engagement with the public to the extent that it makes sense in the countries where that can happen. And then we'll get state, and I don't mean state like California or Maryland, I mean state like country state level policy development, which will then lead to not just policies, but policies that have bite, that there are real penalties for when people don't follow the rules as they may be articulated. So here's another, last slide, another editorial from Nature, much more recently, September of this year, as it says, taking stock of research ethics in human genome editing, which more or less says this, right? So the particular requirements of studies will differ, but a strong framework for assessing them as early as possible seems to be the best way to ensure that they meet the highest standards. So that sort of should be our goal. How we get there is sort of the work in progress. And so what I've tried to do is give you a sense of the history of how we've tried to do this. Fits and starts, not always for the best reasons in terms of underlying framework or principles, but now we have an opportunity to get it right going forward. And with that, I'll stop, and we'll have time for questions and comments. So thanks. I don't know how to do this, and since we're streaming, you probably want people to have microphones so that it can be heard on the recording. Okay, I will do that. So people can talk really loudly so I can hear, and then I'll repeat the question if you have any. Rabbi Dorf. Yeah. Yeah. So the comment was, as a member of one of the committees, I guess, at CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, the state of California, in trying to craft its own policies, looked to they weren't really guidelines, it was more informational guidance that came from the national academies, actually, around stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, and used that as a basis, I guess is what you're saying, for the formation of policy in California. And isn't that a good model? And I think that is. It's a very good example of where things might go well. The problem, of course, is if you've got different states endorsing different policies, California could be different than Maryland, could be different than Massachusetts. So that's one thing to think about. And the second, we do better, I think, as a matter of overall funding if we don't have states going on their own or needing to go on their own, which is really the California story. And besides, California is sort of a country-level economy on its own, but the rest of the states in the United States are not. And so it creates a kind of a problem for the rest of us, where people are, strongly encouraged to move to places like California where there's investment in the research that they're doing. Not to mention you can live in LA or San Diego or San Francisco, right, versus places where there isn't investment and it isn't quite as nice a place to live either. And so that feels like not the best answer. It clearly is a way around what are restrictions on important science. So I would much rather us have a coherent policy approach at the federal level with investment behind it. But absent that, I think you're absolutely right, that the states will need to go this alone. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think a really important comment. So let me rephrase it and to say, where do norms come from is really your question. And the model that has been sort of descriptively the case has been expert committees have been formed and articulate policies based on some sense of principles or norms. And where do those come from? And shouldn't the public be, shouldn't we understand what the public thinks as a way of informing that, if not deciding it? And so one option would be a democratic process, although that will probably not get what you're thinking about. It really goes to what counts as sufficient public engagement, I think, is how I would put that. And we in the United States don't do what I would think of as sufficient public engagement. To the extent that we engage the public at all, it tends to be about informing them. And so we try to do science communication and telling people sort of about science, but we don't engage them in the sense of asking them to come in and talk with the scientific community and the people who are charged with making policy or informing the making of policy to really get a deeper sense of what animates them in terms of what's right, what's appropriate from an ethics or societal perspective. I will say the example of mitochondrial replacement in the UK is a much better version, I think, of what you're imagining. But it's very expensive to do, takes a really long time. They went all over the UK, which is not that hard as compared to it would be in the United States or China, say, but still, they went all over the UK, held town hall meetings multiple times in many of the communities to really try to understand how the communities that they were interacting with understood and felt about this technology advancing, which then informed their members of parliament. So that's a kind of the gold standard, I would say. Now, how often do we need to do that would be one question. And how would we do something like that in the United States? So we can do better than we have done, I would say. Go to any of your science museums in whatever city you live in, and that's sort of the level of engaging the public that we do. But it's not asking them questions, except to the extent that you sometimes are offered the opportunity to write a little note at an exhibition and stick it into a box so that it can be collected and posted somewhere, right? But that's not really trying to inform the policymaking process. I will say, this won't feel like a good answer, but I will say that in the National Academies process, which I know fairly well, there always is an opportunity for the public to weigh in. They're both invited to come physically, only helps people who can get to DC or wherever the meetings might be held, and speak for usually 3 to 5 minutes, again, may not feel sufficient, or via email or social media or posting on a website, giving input that way. So at least you get a sense, but that just rewards people who have the loudest voices or can mobilize the biggest community to either be for or against. So I don't think it's a kind of way of taking the temperature. The one other thing that we don't do in this country as well as they do in Europe is something, I forget what it's called, the Eurobarometer, I think, which every other year, I think, they do a scan of the EU community, the population, about a whole range of issues, but which includes science and controversial science, to sort of see where people's thinking is in a range of topics. But we don't do that. I don't know whether that's all that helpful, but at least it gives them something on which to base decision-making, which is more than we have even. Yeah, in the back. You're going to have to talk really loudly, though. Barely. But it's partly me. I have a little bit of hearing loss, so it's hard. Yeah, it's a really great point. So I will say that both in the mitochondrial replacement example and the Human Genome Editing Committee, on which I also served, I should have said that. So I'm a philosopher by training, as you may have heard go by in the introduction. So that at least is part of the answer to your question. But in both of the mitochondrial replacement and genome editing examples, there were panels convened of panels of experts brought in to talk to those committees of people who came from various faith traditions to try to get a sense of the religious perspective in both of those cases, the technology and how they would be viewed by various religious traditions, to try to help inform, right, what would be acceptable, what would be unacceptable, what would be really enthusiastically endorsed, what would be something that they would find totally unacceptable. not as a way of sort of creating hard lines either way, but to inform the discussion. That said, I would say, especially in the human genome editing case, there are way too many scientists at the table. Because the science is the science. I mean, you need a few people to make sure you get it right, but you don't need half of a committee to be made up of scientists, because that starts to feel like defending the scientific status quo rather than really trying to take on the questions. And especially when you start talking about the kind of work I do, there's a range of perspectives. You need more than one or two people who come from an approach to these issues from a bioethics or philosophically oriented tradition to really feel like you're unearthing all of the kinds of questions you should be. That's hard to do for some of these expert bodies or the organizations that create them, because they're so much about science. That's their tradition, or about medicine. They aren't the National Academy of people thinking about ethics, right? They're the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Engineering, Royal Academy of Medicine. And so it's really, I think, a challenge to try to do better at that. I think it's much better in 2017 than it was 25 years ago, but there's plenty of work to be done. The other thing I would say is the process by which those kinds of committees issue their reports isn't just the experts get together and write them behind closed doors. There's a very thorough peer review process, which includes the kinds of people you're thinking about who weigh in. And not just so, okay, they had their opportunity to talk about whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, but whatever critique they give back has to be addressed by the committee in its report. So there's actually a taking very seriously sense of the critiques and how they get included in the actual discussion. So I would encourage you to read some of these reports, and not just the recommendations, but the actual analysis, which I think do much better at some of the things you're thinking about than certainly used to be the case. A little bit of self-interested defense on my part because I'm involved in them, but I think it is objectively true that there's much more attention to the kinds of things you're thinking about. The clock on the back says 1. I don't know how slavish you are to time. I certainly am fine hanging around, but I don't want to make people feel like they have to sit. Sure. Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's a philosophical question, or a question that could be best addressed by philosophy. Sorry, it is certainly an important kind of foundational question. And part of the answer to that is really practical. It's the sort of the real politics answer, which is to have the people who you're most worried about behaving that way be part of the conversation and discussion. And so I don't think it's not at all inappropriate to say that the Chinese are investing in these areas in a way that is sort of unprecedented. And with very well-trained scientists, either trained in the US or now increasingly trained in China, and coming back and building giant laboratories and very large institutions devoted to working on these areas in ways that allow them to be first. There's a real investment, not just in money, but in sort of national pride in being at the lead in this area of science. And they have some somewhat different understandings or considerations when it comes to things like the use of human embryos, which I take to be part of the force of your question. And that, as I said, I'm not wanting to assess whether their approach is from a moral perspective one that's appropriate or inappropriate. But how do we make sure we're talking about this in a way that we actually are discussing with each other? And what will happen, of course, is a desire for other countries to keep up. Right, so everybody wants to lead, but if you can't lead, you certainly want to keep up with the leaders. And so among the pleas that I have made to the people who will listen is that we need to invest and create pathways for the science to go forward at the leading edge in responsible ways, yes, of course. But to say we won't do certain things leaves the opportunity for others not only to be ahead of us competitively, but to be less responsible. And that's not where we would, I think, choose to be if we would sit back and think about it that way. I remember it was last week before, I think, right before Thanksgiving, invited to testify before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. So that's Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, for those of you who are wonkish enough to care about names, the ones who are in a bipartisan effort to save the federal subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. That's that committee. So you're invited to testify. So I'm not subpoenaed there, but you sort of feel like if you want to have any role in the policymaking process, you need to show up and talk to those folks. And what most resonates with them, here's the answer to your question, is relevant to that experience. What resonates most for them is that we don't want to fall behind in the sort of science competitiveness area, which for them translates into, can we have companies that will sell stuff? But if that's the hook, that's fine, right? To get them to not do certain things and to invest in certain areas, that's fine. It doesn't really matter what the motivation is. It does, of course, but in the realpolitik aspects, if that gets us to the right outcome, then so be it. It isn't such a trade with the devil, I don't think. So I think that there are just sort of the realities of how the process works that need to really be the thing we pay most attention to. And then there needs to be good foundational underpinnings for the discussions that happen. That's the philosophy part. And there aren't enough of us, so that's a kind of plea for people to study these areas. It's, I think, a very open and important field of study. And the more people we can get engaged in working in these areas, the better it will be. How to get people paid to do this is, of course, a different question, but I think it's a really important area of work. So I encourage you to be thinking about that if you're at that stage in your life. We'd be done? Okay, my pleasure.